I'm Paul Barclay. Welcome to Big Ideas on RN and online at abc.net.au/RN. Tonight we address one of the most difficult questions society is struggling with: euthanasia and assisted suicide. People on both sides of the fence have equally strong feelings on the topic. The population is ageing, science is improving medical care at an accelerating rate, but when should doctors withdraw the treatment keeping the dying alive? Should we have the right to choose ending suffering and pain? What about those not terminally ill, but simply too tired of life to go on? At the recent International Conference on the End of Life in Brisbane, Peter Singer and Charles Camosy debated the ethics of euthanasia. Peter Singer is a philosopher and author, and he's Professor of Bioethics at Princeton University and Laureate Professor at the University of Melbourne. Charles Camosy is Associate Professor of Christian Ethics at Fordham University in New York. His current project bridges the gap between social justice liberals and pro-life conservatives in proposing a public policy compromise on abortion. Let's hear now about the end of life from an ethical perspective, starting with Peter Singer.
So, because we're talking about questions about euthanasia, which are and physician-assisted suicide, which are questions about, at least in the case of euthanasia, questions about killing, I think if you want to look at this philosophically, you need to begin by asking the most fundamental question: why is it normally wrong to kill another human being? And I think a very brief answer to that would mention a number of different things. Firstly, normally the person that you kill wants to go on living. So in killing them, you're depriving them of something that they want, and you're also violating their autonomous choice to continue to live. Secondly, you are depriving them of the rest of their life. And although it may seem an optimistic assumption, I think it's reasonable to say that for most people, that means you're depriving them of good things, things that on balance are good. We want to go on living not just for the hell of it, but because generally we think life is worthwhile. It brings us good things. It brings us all kinds of forms of happiness and enrichment and things that we value. And if somebody is killed, they lose all of that. And thirdly, there is also a kind of third-party reason, and that is people are parts of families and relationships and friendships, and when someone is killed, that's often a tragedy to the people who loved and cared for that person. So I think they're all good reasons why normally we should think that killing someone is a very seriously wrong thing to do. But now let's talk about the circumstances in which someone might request euthanasia or request physician assistance in dying. And if we think about those circumstances, then it rapidly becomes clear that it's probable that none of those reasons that I just mentioned will apply, or at least very likely that two of them won't apply and the other one will be somewhat mitigated in its force. So firstly, as I said, the first reason is if you kill someone, they want to go on living. You're violating their autonomy. But we're talking about voluntary euthanasia or physician assistance on request in dying. So now, in helping someone to die, in killing them if they request voluntary euthanasia, you're actually responding to what they want. You're respecting their autonomy. You're not violating it at all. So that reason against killing goes in the opposite direction in this case, where it is what the person wants, what the person autonomously requests. The second reason also generally won't apply here, because people who believe that the rest of their life has a balance, a positive balance, that the good things outweigh the bad things, are not going to request voluntary euthanasia or physician assistance in dying. they are making that request because the quality of their life has fallen to a point that is not acceptable to them. The negatives outweigh the positives. And they don't foresee that changing. And in fact, where we have legislation for this effect, the legislation often requires that they have thought about this carefully, that a second physician has been consulted to confirm the prognosis, and so on. So you can have a high degree of certainty that your life is not going to have any more that positive balance that, fortunately, is the case for most of us during our lives. So those two reasons, which are the two, I think, central reasons relating directly to the person who is killed, to the interest of the person who is killed, do not apply. Now, it may, of course, be true that the family and friends of the person who requests voluntary euthanasia or assistance in dying still love that person and will still grieve when that person dies. But if they do love that person, they will also respect that this is what the person they love wants. And they will not want that person to suffer against his or her will. And they will want that person's autonomy to be respected. And insofar as they will grieve because that person is no longer with them, at least in the cases where we're talking about somebody who has a terminal illness, which is the great majority of cases in which one would envisage voluntary euthanasia or physician assistance in dying, then they're going to be grieving, sadly, anyway, before very long. So I don't think that third reason really applies in the cases that we're considering either. So I think we have to think about it in that rather fundamental way. We have to think about what is it that normally makes killing wrong, and are there circumstances in which these don't apply? And if so, then we don't have the kind of prima facie reason for thinking that it is wrong to kill someone. Now, all of that, in a way, seems fairly obvious. So you might say, well, why is it that it's still the case that in most of the world we do not have either physician-assisted suicide or voluntary euthanasia accepted in law and therefore able to be openly practiced? And one argument that has been quite powerful, I think, in opposing proposals for legislation is the argument that although you might have some exceptions where in fact it would not be intrinsically a bad thing if someone got assistance in dying, nevertheless you're not going to be able to confine the cases of killing to just those cases. Once you open the door a crack, once you put in the thin end of the wedge, once the camel puts its nose in the tent, you're not going to be able to stop the camel getting in or the wedge driving forward, or to use the other metaphor that's often invoked, sliding further down the slippery slope. And those arguments will be very familiar if you've been thinking about this area. And they tell us that killing is going to widen to people who don't request it, and perhaps it's going to require widen to people who the community thinks are a burden in one way or another, and inevitably at some point the Nazis and the Holocaust get brought up into the argument. Now, when I started doing bioethics, thinking about these issues in the 1970s, I didn't think that argument was plausible, but I also didn't really have clear evidence with which to refute it, because at that time we had no jurisdiction in which either voluntary euthanasia or physician assistance in dying was openly practiced, in which we had evidence of what was happening. But fortunately, that has subsequently changed, and we now have quite a lot of experience and a lot of evidence. Although, as I said a moment ago, not from the majority of jurisdictions, but we have had the open practice of voluntary euthanasia in the Netherlands since around 1990, following some court decisions. and we've had the full legalisation of it, I think 2001, if I remember rightly, anyway, around that time, so more than a decade. We subsequently had the legalisation a similar way in Belgium, which, not coincidentally, of course, is a neighbouring country to the Netherlands and one where the majority of inhabitants speak Dutch and so can watch Dutch television or read Dutch newspapers and are therefore in a better position than any other country in the world to be well informed about what's happening in the Netherlands. Also in Luxembourg, another neighbouring country. So we have 3 countries where that's been fully legalised, and now we have a number of states of the United States where you can practice physician assistance in dying. A doctor can write someone a lethal prescription on request, and that's Oregon, 1998, I think, so something like 16 years. Then Washington, again a neighbouring state, we get the same phenomenon, and Montana as a result of a court decision, and now more recently in Vermont, where the practice is just starting. So we have good studies of these jurisdictions, particularly in the Netherlands, where we've had long-term studies going back to around 1990, and also we have a good set of figures, for example, published by the state of Oregon. And I think these do clearly refute the slippery slope argument. There just isn't any serious evidence of this happening. If you look at the Netherlands, in the first study, which was before voluntary euthanasia had been fully legalised but was being openly practiced as a result of the court decisions, we found that about 1.7% of deaths were the result of voluntary euthanasia. Now, more recent studies, so 20 years later after full legalisation, it's got up to about 3%, about 1 death in 33. So it's not a very dramatic increase over that period of time, and it's more or less what you might expect with greater discussion and greater knowledge of the situation. If you look at Oregon, you find, firstly, a much lower rate of use of physician assistance in dying. Only about 1 in 400 deaths in Oregon is a result of the use of that legislation. And although there's been a small increase, it's a very slight increase. I think the most recent figure was 77 deaths per year in the last year, and that had risen from 30 or 40 when the legislation first came in, but it's still a very low figure. An interesting figure, incidentally, from Oregon is that the number of prescriptions written under the legislation is significantly higher than the number of deaths. So it was around 125 in the year in which 77 used it. So clearly people like to have the prescription. They like to be in control. They like to know that they can end their life if things get bad. And the fact that they do that but they don't necessarily use it shows, I think, that it really is an autonomous decision that they're making. And it's not like they're under some great social pressure. Now you've got the prescription, you've got to use it. It's not like that. It's still up to their choice. So I think the slippery slope argument really is refuted by the evidence. Now there's one other thing that I want to say. We're going to be discussing in this conference later on questions about withholding and withdrawing treatment and about terminal sedation. And I think it's important that these things are all quite widely practiced. They're more or less an inevitable part of modern medicine and the intensive care powers that we have, that in every intensive care unit you're going to have decisions to withhold or withdraw treatment, and in some cases to put patients into terminal sedation. And these are legal in pretty much every jurisdiction that practices modern medicine. Now, I think they're also clearly decisions to end life, and it would take a little longer to develop this argument in full, but I don't think there's a really significant moral difference between, on the one case, withdrawing treatment, and on the other case, ending life deliberately. That's what the highest court in Britain said in the case of Anthony Bland, who was someone who was in a persistent vegetative state and whom the doctor said could never recover. And the parents and hospital requested permission to withdraw feeding from him. Inevitably, of course, he was going to die. If you don't feed somebody, they're going to die. And the judges, some of the judges said, it may seem strange that we're authorising the withdrawal of feeding tube, but that it would not be legal to give him an injection. They said, well, that's not up for us to decide, though. all we can do is apply the law as we see it. That's up to Parliament to change. So I think the judges were right. My time is up. I have to stop at this point. But I think the judges were right that there is no really clear distinction here, and it's, if you like, a historical accident in a way, in the way law has developed, that we allow one set of decisions to end life, but we do not allow another. And I think that should be changed. Thank you.
I'd also like to thank Peter in particular for doing yet another debate with me. But I must say the generous way that he engages his opponents allows genuine disagreement to take place. And reaching genuine disagreement is quite a rare thing when it comes to discussion of issues like euthanasia. One specific thing I think is necessary for an actual disagreement to take place, at least in my experience, is a willingness to work hard at finding out where we agree. And believe it or not, there is a lot on these topics about which Peter and I agree. And I'd like to start there by highlighting three major areas. The first is brain death. Lots of confusion in the euthanasia debate could be unpacked, it seems to me, by distinguishing between questions about moral status and personhood from very different kinds of questions about killing, treatment, and care. Oftentimes, people aren't even talking about the same topic. Much of the debate surrounding end-of-life issues is about moral status, and particularly about the moral status of those who have damaged brains, such that they at least appear to have lost consciousness or some other similarly valuable trait. One of the most dramatic questions about moral status involves something we often imprecisely call brain death. In many cases, those we affix with this label are clearly living members of the species Homo sapiens with homeostasis, with the ability to fight off infections, with the ability to react to bodily trauma, with, among other things, an increased heart rate, and even, as we saw in two very public stories in the United States recently, the ability to gestate another life. Peter and I both agree that to describe these living members of our species as dead is a bad mistake. Indeed, we agree that the history of our shift towards doing so came mostly from a desire to transfer organs after the invention of the ventilator. Now, to be clear, Peter doesn't think these living human beings should be considered persons with a legal right to life. But many of you will be aware that Peter makes the human-person distinction consistently in other cases as well, such that many other living human beings fail to count as persons as well, those with substantial mental disability and even newborn infants. Happily, the medical professions have largely rejected Peter's view of personhood and instead insists that all living human beings count as persons with the right to life. And Peter and I agree that so-called brain-dead individuals are living human beings. First agreement. Second one is one that he actually talked about. He finished by talking about aiming at death by omission and inaction. Ending life on the basis of personhood or moral status is one thing, but ending it when there is no disagreement about moral status is a very different kind of question, as I mentioned earlier, and here too we have important agreements. For instance, let me say that I totally agree with Peter that there is no difference, morally speaking, between aiming at death by omission and aiming at it by action. Removing the G-tube of a baby or PVS patient because she has an unacceptable quality of life is aiming at death, period. It is euthanasia. But though Peter and I agree about the logical connection, I would reason the other way and say we should never aim at the death of an innocent person, in either case, whether by action or omission. And I'll say more about why later, but I think even agreeing on the logical connection is a very important agreement. The third point of agreement I want to highlight involves giving large doses of pain medication at the end of life. This is more of an agreement about what could be done in practice rather than an agreement about the underlying moral reasoning, but it's still a very important agreement, perhaps even more important, given that it deals with actual policy. Now, Peter and I agree that, one, we can give someone racked with severe pain a very large dose of pain medication. Two, we agree that such a large dose is designed to control their pain. And three, we agree that such a large dose will likely speed their death. Now, Peter's reasoning is that he uses the death, or one can use the death of the patient as the means by which the pain is controlled. And I disagree with that. Again, I believe that we should never aim at the death of an innocent person. But I do think that if a large dose of pain medication is necessary to control one's pain, you can give that large dose, as long as one merely foresees but does not intend that death will be hastened by that dose. Some will say this kind of reasoning is intellectual game playing or cheating because you know the result will be death in both cases. But this is a strange reaction given how much we use this kind of reasoning in other situations. Suppose, for instance, a parent decides to withdraw chemotherapy from her 6-year-old daughter with end-stage liver cancer. Simply because she knows this will speed her daughter's death, it simply doesn't follow that that's no different from aiming at her death. Not at all. In fact, if the cancer were to go into remission, the parent would be overjoyed. Her aim was to reduce her daughter's pain by removing chemotherapy, and the means by this was accomplished was not killing her. Her death was foreseen, but it was not intended. This kind of reasoning, which foresees but does not aim at death, is employed thousands of times every day in ICUs all over the world. Far from cheating, it is in some ways at the heart of the West's end-of-life reasoning, and we ought to keep it that way. Speaking of keeping it that way, let's talk a little bit more about disagreement. So why should we care about not aiming at the death of an innocent person? Perhaps while it's a good rule of thumb, morally speaking, aren't there just obvious exceptions? And didn't Peter talk about some of those? I don't think so, and for two basic kinds of reasons. First, historically, we know that those exceptions are generally formed for those who don't have power in a particular culture, those without a voice to speak up for themselves, those whose dignity we find most inconvenient. Native peoples, racial minorities, the very young, and importantly for our conference, the very old. Second, I reject the idea that persons are the kinds of beings which have reducible value such that we can kill them. In fact, part of the reason many of us have the category of person at all is precisely to say that they have irreducible value, the kind of value which cannot be calculated away and used as a mere means to some other end. Persons are ends in themselves. Furthermore, the exceptionalist rule against killing the innocent is especially important for healthcare providers. Healthcare providers are professionals. That is, they are not just another person selling resources in a marketplace. Healthcare professionals have a telos, a vocation, and it is to provide healthcare. Shocking. Describing killing as healthcare means stretching the definition of health beyond what I think a reasonable person should accept. Now, one might be doing something that one and one's patient both think is in their best interests, but I hope it goes without saying that not everything one does in another's best interests is properly described as healthcare. The view that killing someone is not healthcare is behind many of the views in my country from people who are uncomfortable with healthcare providers administering lethal injections and the death penalty. Intuitively, we know it is true. Physicians are healers, not killers. But even if we come to the conclusion that it is better for someone to die than live, calling the killing healthcare seems to me to be deeply problematic. Now, one response to my argument would be simply to reject the idea that medicine is a profession in the first place, and instead claim that a medical interaction with a patient is just another market transaction. I call this the Burger King model of medicine, where you get it your way. But I think this would be a terrible development for medicine. Part of what marks the future healthcare providers I helped train in bioethics at Fordham is that they have each of them, I see it in their eyes, has a professional vocation or calling to be healers. Once we deconstruct that concept, the market takes over and we lose any sense of the profession's integrity or that there is a profession at all. Being a healthcare provider simply becomes whatever the market says it is. Another disagreement leads nicely to a second critical point, and that is about the principle of autonomy, something that Peter mentioned very early on. Some reject the very idea that a Western pluralistic culture can come up with a common understanding of medicine or health as a profession with a telos. Thus, autonomy becomes a primary value. We let individuals make their own decisions about their health care. But there are many good reasons to question the huge role that autonomy plays and continues to play at higher levels in our bioethics discourse, in particular, and end of life in general. What happens when there is a conflict between the autonomy of the patient and the autonomy of the healthcare provider? or between one parent and another parent deciding something about the health care of their child, or between the state and a parent who wants their child's surgery to be done without blood transfusion. With these cases, I submit the appeal to autonomy is an illusion. What we need instead is a common understanding of the good in order to work through the disagreement. But that common understanding of the good is precisely what our Western pluralistic cultures and secular bioethics have tried to avoid discussing. Peter's an important exception to that, however. And autonomy is also an illusion in other kinds of cases. The right to abortion, for instance, based on autonomy is well known. But such arguments usually come from people of power and privilege. Those who do not have power and privilege rarely speak of autonomy, precisely because they know they don't have it. Those concerned about marginalized populations are speaking more and more of reproductive justice, which is an appeal to a specific understanding of the good. Something similar, I argue, can be said of autonomy as it's used at the end of life. We have an ableist and ageist culture in the developed West, mostly as a result of our values being formed by a market economy. Those who have the prospect of producing capital are valuable, while those who are net drains on capital are disvalued. Unsurprisingly, those who are sent the signals that they are net drains then feel pushed to the margins of our culture and become tired of life, not to mention how being sick and in pain impacts the rationality of one's choices. So what should our response be from someone who on the margins exercises their autonomous choice and says they want to die? My instinct as a justice-centered person is to work to change our culture to help individuals see that their value is not determined by a market. Exactly the wrong response to this problem, it seems to me, is to make it easier for marginalized populations like the old and disabled and sick and in pain, to make it easier for such populations to kill themselves, and then claim that all we are doing is letting them express their autonomous choice. I submit that their choices are structurally coerced and that justice requires we change our social structures and attitudes. Now, finally, let me make a final point related to the slippery slope. This is maybe the most important disagreement that Peter and I have. As long as autonomy is the primary value in our culture and in bioethics more generally, I think we're going to struggle with something like the slippery slope at the end of life. For given this primary value, at the end of the day, who is anyone else to put limits on what could count as a good reason to form a contract with another person to kill oneself? We live in a pluralistic culture with multiple understandings of the good. So any attempt to limit the reasons for euthanasia violates personal autonomy. All of us, I think, are moved with pity for the person racked with pain with probably only days to live. But once we start sliding down the euthanasia path, it is very difficult to stop. Who are we to say that one must be terminally ill? Who are we to say what terminally ill means? Who are we to limit the policy to unbearable suffering? Who are we to say what unbearable suffering means? In a pluralistic culture defined by personal autonomy, it is the individual who makes these calls, not the state, not the medical profession. All these judgments involve deep and complex appeals to a particular understanding of the good. And haven't our pluralistic cultures attempted to make room for various different understandings? Indeed, given the strong autonomy claims of Western democracies, it's difficult to know on what basis we would prohibit assisted suicide at all, even if one was simply tired of life. And let me just conclude by mentioning the Netherlands. We saw that Peter is skeptical of the kinds of slippery slope arguments, but the Netherlands is really the only country with a substantial history to study in this regard. And at first, as with most policies, euthanasia, with regard to euthanasia, the Dutch wanted to keep the practice narrow and have strict safeguards, like explicit consent, limiting terminal illness, hopeless and unbearable suffering. Today, however, each of these safeguards has been surpassed. Explicit consent has gone through the window with the Groningen Protocol of euthanasia of newborns. Belgium recently allowed for child euthanasia. Terminal illness required? Not at all. The Daily Mail recently reported on euthanasia granted to a Dutch woman given the fact that she was losing her sight. Hopeless and unbearable suffering consider the recent Dutch petition to allow euthanasia for those over 70 who are tired of life. It got well over 100,000 signatures, as well as the support of the Liberal and Green parties. So it's difficult to deny the consistency of their reasoning. And let me just really conclude with one quote from Theo Boer. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing his name right, B-O-E-R. He's a Dutch official responsible for reviewing euthanasia cases, and he recently wrote an open letter to the UK, who's arguing about these issues right now, as you may know, about his experiences as this official. He says, quote, "I used to be a supporter of the Dutch law, but now with 12 years of experience, I take a very different view. At the very least, wait for an honest and intellectually satisfying analysis of the reasons behind the increase in the numbers. Is it because the law should have had better safeguards? Or is it because the mere existence of such a law is an invitation to see assisted suicide and euthanasia as a normality instead of a last resort? Before those questions are answered, don't go there. Once the genie is out of the bottle, it is not likely ever to go back in again." Thank you.
What control do you have over dying, and should we have any control at all? You're tuned to Big Ideas on RN, and on our website you can share your thoughts about this controversial topic. Please keep your comments civil. After their presentations, Professor Peter Singer and Associate Professor Charles Camosy debated the ethics of euthanasia and assisted suicide with the audience.
I think there are many interesting things that you've said. I think one that would be good to discuss is the question of autonomy and how far we ought to go. And I'm not sure if you're aware, but in Australia there's been quite a lot of the debate about that recently because of Dr. Philip Nitschke's assistance, or perhaps he didn't assist, but anyway, involvement in some respect with somebody who ended their life when they were not terminally ill, but depressed. There's a lot more, I think, to that case that could be discussed, but it raises questions about what should we be defending and what not. Should we be defending the idea of everybody to end their life if they've given it due reflection and thought over a long period of time? I think those are real questions. I don't think it's obvious that it's wrong to do that. It's also not obvious that it's right to do that. But I think there are questions that are worth discussing as to who ought to make that decision. And advocates of voluntary euthanasia, I think, ought to be prepared to engage in that. I mean, maybe for policy purposes you can say, as the legislation does in Oregon and Washington, well, 2 doctors must say that you're likely to die within 6 months. But I don't really think that's necessary. And you mentioned the Netherlands. The Netherlands actually never tried to say that you have to be terminally ill. Terminally ill or unbearable suffering that could not be relieved was the criterion. And I think that's a perfectly reasonable criterion. So I don't think there's been any further slipping down the slope there. And the Groningen Protocol is actually also not really evidence of that because the numbers of cases are tiny. And in fact, in the last 10 years, I think it's been applied, at least in Groningen, from only in 2 cases. So I'm sure there are many more cases where it happens, if you like, without being so openly discussed in other countries. I don't think that's evidence of a slippery slope. But I hope there's people from the Netherlands, or certainly from Belgium perhaps, who will comment on that in discussion. The only other thing that I want to say is that I think we ought to stress that people who want to end their lives are not just necessarily in pain, where you might say, well, you can give them this large dose of narcotics or whatever that will relieve their pain and end their life. But if you look at the studies of Oregon, the most frequently mentioned reasons why people wanted to end their lives, around over 80% for each of these 3, they could tick more than one box. A loss of autonomy, decreasing ability to participate in activities that made life enjoyable, and loss of dignity. Those 3 all were considered reasons by over 80%, whereas inadequate pain control was only 23%. So, there are going to be these cases where you're not going to be able to help them with the injection, with applying the doctrine of double effect. And the question is, why shouldn't they be able to make those choices? Why aren't those good reasons when people are terminally ill for enabling them to make that decision that they don't want to live the remaining weeks or months?
So Netherlands asks for either terminal or unbearable and hopeless suffering. But it seems to me the counterexample of the woman who's going blind who is offered euthanasia is problematic, right? Because unless you take, but this gets to one of my major points is, for most of us, I think we say, well, that's not unbearable suffering. But at the end of the day, if personal autonomy is the primary value by which we're evaluating the situation, who are we to say that, right? In a pluralistic culture that makes room for multiple understandings of the good, who are we to say that? And right now we have relative agreement in the medical community about these things, but especially as patients' rights are becoming more and more prominent, personal autonomy of the patient is becoming more and more prominent, it's hard for me to see how we put in a stopgap for the slippery slope and just not say the 100,000 signatures for people who are tired of life, right? At the end of the day, personal autonomy is about my choice, my body, my life, my death. If autonomy is the primary value, it's hard for me to see that we're not going to continue to go down this slope. And there's been lots written on locating autonomy in surrogates, especially for children. I don't have time to get into how I feel about that in terms of an argument, but I'm pretty skeptical of the idea we locate a child's autonomy in their parent somehow. And if we're doing things like the Groningen Protocol or child euthanasia in Belgium, I think we're fooling ourselves if we think that the primary value that's being articulated is autonomy. A parent is making a decision by some other value, it's not clear what, but often some sort of utilitarian value, judgment on pleasure over pain, prospects for life, something like that. And so there are all these reasons, I think, why if we appeal to autonomy as our primary value, we're not only going to end up with the things that we've already ended up with, but it's not clear where we put in the stopgap at all.
Well, so now it's your turn.
Yes, my name is Luc Deliens. I'm a sociologist and end-of-life care researcher for 20 years in Belgium. And we have done some empirical studies in Europe. And what we noticed in 2001, the URL study, that it is a reality in all countries that have been investigated in Europe. So we studied the incidence of euthanasia in Belgium, in the Netherlands, but also in Italy, also in Denmark, also in Sweden. We noticed that it is a medical practice in all of these countries, next, of course, to all other end-of-life decisions. So that's a reality that you have to face as a society. Second issue is that what we see in the Netherlands and in Belgium, if you compare the quality of these practices prior to the law and after the law, that these practices have been substantially improved from a point of view of the quality of the end-of-life care. From the point of view of the clinical way they administer the drugs, the lethal drugs, but also from a point of view of the quality of the communication between the patients and the doctors, between the patients and the nurses, between the nurses and the physicians. So there's a substantial improvement in the way euthanasia has been practiced after legalization of the law. So is it not ethical desirable to regulate these practices?
I think that's for you, Charlie.
I think that would depend on this particular society. So the Iran study, which was limited in several ways, but was limited in obvious ways in that it dealt with certain cultures. And it's not clear that every society is going to benefit from regulating this rather than trying to dissuade it. I'd grant you that some cultures, that's probably the case. But I think it's not just the quality in the sense that you are referring to it. It's the question that Theo Baer, am I pronouncing his name right? B-O-E-R, asked at the end, which is, if the law is a teacher, the law has a pedagogical function in cultures. And if you legalize something, we now know, there's lots of studies on this, that it changes the culture's understanding. And instead of becoming an exceptional thing, it can become a sort of just another option, right? And so that would be the thing that I would worry about in addition to it's cleaner, it's more legal, it's more transparent, it's more upfront, less mistakes happen, et cetera. I worry about what legalizing does it from a pedagogical point of view in a culture and then the slippery slope associated with that.
My name is Agnes van der Heijden. I'm from the Netherlands, and I've been involved in most of the studies that have been done in the Netherlands that Peter Singer was referring to. First of all, I would like to indeed say that having a terminal illness has never been part of the regulations of euthanasia in the Netherlands. Secondly, I think the fact that issues such as euthanasia for people who don't have diseases but are old and weary of life, euthanasia for people who had a diagnosis of dementia and asked for euthanasia because of that, euthanasia for children, for neonates, are all topics that are currently fiercely debated in the Netherlands, which shows that having a law about euthanasia doesn't end the debate. Of course, the law involves several limits, but these limits are obviously debated in the Netherlands. And the case you are referring to about the woman who received euthanasia because she was developing blindness, it is fiercely debated in the Netherlands whether or not that is a good thing that such a patient receives euthanasia. And I think that's in principle a good thing and a logical consequence of regulating euthanasia, that such cases are discussed and that there are now and then cases that are open for discussion and open for debate, and not the cases that are the more or less standard cases of euthanasia.
I agree with you, and I think these are issues that ought to be discussed. And in a way, they're being discussed in the Netherlands before they're being discussed in other countries because you've had longer experience of being able to do this openly. I don't have a clear sense of exactly, where you would draw the barrier, as Charlie is asking, and whether indeed it's reasonable for someone to say, without my sight, I don't think that my life would have sufficient quality or not. I mean, that's something that ought to be discussed. The only thing I would say directly about what Charlie said is that if you are going to quote one member of that review committee, we ought to look at the committee as a whole and what all of the members thought about that. And then we will have a better context into which to place Mr. Boer's remarks in context and see whether this is a kind of one view out of several views where others don't see it that way.
The example of the woman who's going blind being debated in the Netherlands is sort of a classic exhibit A for the kind of argument I'm trying to make. We can have this debate as a culture around this issue, but ultimately, isn't it the case that the individual patient gets to make the call? And there's a contract made with a healthcare provider to do it. And so we can have all the debate we want about what all of us think standing outside this situation. But if autonomy is the primary value that we're using to evaluate, this is not clear it's interesting and I think even fun to talk about. But at the end of the day, who are we to decide for this person who's going blind that they don't have hopeless and unbearable suffering?
But now, Charlie, you're taking actually a more stronger line of autonomy than I did, and I think anyone else has. I didn't say autonomy was the only relevant value. I think it's a value that we ought to consider. But maybe, in some cases, you wouldn't accept it because of the loss of other goods.
Sure, but it's not clear, as I said, in a Western pluralistic democracy on what basis we would do that, right? And especially in contemporary secular discussions of bioethics, at least in the United States and the UK, autonomy is this sort of trump card you pull out and you say, well, we all have different understandings of good. It's not clear how we're going to resolve our differences, so personal autonomy, right? Now, you're an exception to that. I think you've tried to make an argument for a particular understanding of the good. But frustratingly, I don't think there are many others doing that kind of spade work.
Sandra Bradley, Flinders University. I'd like to unpack this, what I consider a fallacy of equating do no harm with thou shalt not kill. I come from the nursing profession, and we provide care from birth through till death. And I'm not quite sure why there's this idea that doctors don't engage with death care.
Well, just to be a little bit more precise about what I was trying to say, I don't think I ever said anything about do no harm. I think that's a different kind of argument. We can have that argument, if you like, about whether killing is harmful in, say, or if there are exceptions where killing is not harmful. But the argument I made was to say that to call it an example of healthcare is deeply problematic. And actually, I think just a misunderstanding of what healthcare is. Now, that's not an argument for much of anything except to say we shouldn't call it as part of healthcare, and it's not clear why healthcare providers would even be the ones to do it. And I think it's an interesting example to think about. I'm not a supporter of the death penalty at all, but to think about the death penalty in the United States and why are so many people uncomfortable with healthcare providers being the ones to administer the lethal drugs and the death penalty in the United States. Well, I think it's because we have this instinct that that's not what healthcare providers ought to be doing. Is it harm? Is it not in every situation? I think there are really tough cases where I would be hard-pressed to say that that's an example of harm. But I'm pretty comfortable saying that it's not an example of healthcare.
Thank you very much. Eric Wazelenko, I'm a palliative care physician and an ethics consultant in Western Canada. I have a great respect for the place of medicine in the journey of people's lives, but I also have a great sense of humility in the place of medicine in the journey of people's lives. And I'm a bit surprised, and I'll challenge you both, and thank you for your excellent, thoughtful comments. A challenge about how we can see that there is no moral distinction between, to use a phrase, killing and letting die, or between killing and withdrawing interventions, when one might look at medicine as really merely an intervener in the journey of a person's life. And the challenge might be that if we come from a Western society that really believes that medicine has done amazing things, will continue to do amazing things, and is at the pinnacle of how we might intervene with the person. Why is that view the correct view? And can we challenge the notion that there is no distinction between killing and letting die when we view medicine in a different way?
Certainly the view that there's no distinction can be challenged. It is challenged by a number of philosophers. It's not like there's a philosophical consensus that there's no distinction. In many circumstances, there are distinctions that you can draw. For example, about intention. You might say that somebody who just lets somebody die doesn't have necessarily the same intention as someone who is prepared to undertake an act of killing. So, to take an example from the late philosopher James Rachels, if you want your nephew to die because you'll inherit a lot of money if he does, and you happen to see him trip over and fall face downwards in the bath, and you just decide to leave the room, leaving him to drown quietly, that's one thing, but you could argue that you didn't have the same intention that you would have to have if you actually planned to murder him. So you can draw that distinction, but Rachels would actually have said that they're both clearly wrongful acts, despite the possible differences that you can draw in intention. There's also questions about the certainty that somebody will die. That may apply in some cases, certainly in some medical contexts. You might withdraw the respirator and to your surprise the patient continues to breathe, and maybe even, in 1 in a million cases, the patient goes into a miraculous remission and recovers, I suppose. So the certainty that you're bringing about death is less than if you give the patient a lethal injection. So there are differences around the distinction, but my view would be that where you have comparable intentions and comparable degrees of certainties, and that's why I mentioned withdrawing a feeding tube from a patient in a persistent vegetative state, then I don't really think you have a morally significant distinction.
I would second that, and also just drive home the point that I do think there can be distinctions between killing and letting die, then there should be. But my point was that if you're aiming at death by killing or aiming at death by some omission, the moral description of the act should be the same. So that's all I mean by that. But you can let die, problematic way of talking about it maybe, where the object of your act is not death. And I gave a couple examples of that. And there I think there would be a very important distinction to be made. But if one is aiming at death by taking out a G-tube or refusing to intubate or something like that, it's not clear to me at all why we would describe that situation differently if the death was aimed at by injecting them with an overdose of pain medication or something like that. And this is a really important point because many of my colleagues will be against euthanasia but not have the same skepticism for aiming at death by omission. And Peter's really helpful and important challenge to say, well, wait a minute, if you're against direct killing, there's killing by omission that happens every day, all the time, and not many people talk about it. And I think that's an important thing to think about.
I really wanted to respond just to one thing that Charlie said in these closing remarks. He said something about that euthanasia will be applied to those who are weak and powerless and marginalised, the very old, the ill, those in pain, and that they're not good people, they're not in a good position to make these real decisions for themselves, to think clearly. But I think it's important that the political impetus for change here is not just coming from these people who are at that stage, but it's coming from people who can anticipate that they are likely to be in that position at some later time. So I would be an example of this. I'm certainly not among the weak and marginalised and powerless members of society. And I'm not in pain, and so I'm not able to think clearly without the distraction of pain or terminal illness. But I can anticipate that I may be in such a situation, and I can ask myself, what would I want to be done to me, for me in those situations? And I know that the things that I would want done would not be legal here in Australia. So that's why I'm an advocate for law reform on this issue in Australia. And I think, although you could say, well, yes, you'll get the law, but then in fact it'll be applied in ways that these people don't want. Again, I don't really see the evidence of that. I don't see the evidence that it is being applied in the countries where it exists to people who don't want it. And I think given that those people would have families and others who are observing them, if that were the case, there would be some pressure for repeal of the legislation. But if we look at those countries that have got this legislation in place, and again, the people from the Netherlands and Belgium and so on can say this better than I can, but my understanding is there's been no serious political move for repeal of the legislation. Even though there have been changes of government during the era, they've been shifted to more conservative governments, Christian Democrat coalitions, but there has not been a serious move to repeal the legislation. So I think that does suggest that it's not being applied in harmful ways to the weak and powerless.
Catholics wouldn't run hospitals, right, if we didn't care about healing and particularly palliative care. And that is a central concern. We need to push for palliative care. We need to get better at palliative care. And we've made huge strides. We can even get better. But in the push for the understandable push for reducing suffering where palliative care isn't working, I don't want us to lose the concept of healthcare as something that's a profession, something with a teleology, something that goes beyond what the market says it is. And I think we need to absolutely resist the temptation to let medicine get subsumed by the rest of consumer culture. Burger King version of medicine isn't the way to go. But most of all, I think we need to arrest this slouch, I'll call it a slouch, of secular bioethics towards the myth of autonomy. And instead, let's do the hard philosophical and theological work of arguing with each other about different and explicit understandings of the good and working through these things.
Should voluntary euthanasia be legalised? How ethical is assisted suicide? Difficult questions to ponder. Hopefully this debate has helped you form your views. Peter Singer is Professor of Bioethics at Princeton University and Laureate Professor at the University of Melbourne. Charles Camosy is Associate Professor of Christian Ethics at Fordham University in New York, and they were speaking at the International Conference on End of Life in Brisbane. In case you are worried in any way about suicide or mental health, please contact Beyond Blue on 1300 22 4636 or Lifeline on 131114. I'm Paul Barclay. Thanks for listening. Bye for now.